Hey folks, you're listening to episode 15 of the Deeply Devoted Podcast, a ministry of the E-Free Church of Bemidji, Minnesota. My name is Eric Nygren, and I'm one of the pastors on staff here at E-Free Bemidji. And folks, it is Christmas time. And so this week on the podcast, I'm going to chat with an old friend to talk a little bit about Christology. And what does Christology have to do with Christmas? Well, with me today via Zoom is Dr. Matthew Harmon. Now, I have known Matt since way back in our undergrad days, back at Ohio University down in Athens, Ohio, as well as we were fellow students, MDiv students at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And these days, Dr. Harmon is a professor of New Testament studies at Grace Theological Seminary in Winona Lake, Indiana. And I've done my best to try to keep up with most of the books and commentaries that Doc Harmon has written. I don't have all of them. I don't have the complete works just yet, but we're working on it. But it is indeed my privilege to have Matt on as my guest on today's episode. So Matt, welcome to the Deeply Devoted Podcast.
Great to be with you, Eric, and just really thankful to get to reconnect with you a little bit.
Yeah, this is, usually we bump into each other at maybe a conference or something like that, but to be able to use technology here and, catch up while other people maybe eavesdrop on our conversation here a little bit. We're going to talk about all kinds of things today. We're going to delve into a little bit of Christology. We're going to delve into a little New Testament studies, maybe just kind of catch up about what you're up to, Matt. Well, we're both Ohioans, and that's where our paths first crossed way back in the early 90s. Down in, I have to explain that to folks a lot of times. Even though I grew up in Columbus, I didn't go to Ohio State. I went to Ohio University, the other one, Southeastern Ohio, Athens. Fantastic time down there. But Matt, if you think back to those days, you think back to the early 90s and your time at OU and our time in Crew there. Did you know that one day you'd be teaching in the field of New Testament studies? And how did the Lord lead you to become a New Testament professor?
So when I was involved with Crew at Ohio University as a student, I had a lot of good opportunities to teach and to speak in the weekly meetings and lead small groups and those sorts of things. And I had several staff members and others basically affirm that they saw these kinds of gifts active in me, and that the Lord was bearing fruit through that. And I seemed to have a mind for studying theology and going deeper in some things. And they encouraged me to consider this path. But, it's one of those things where even though late in my time as an undergraduate, I had a sense that the Lord might be leading me in this way, I also knew that I wanted more practical ministry experience before I went off to do any sort of seminary training. So that's why I went on staff with Crew initially, was to just get more ministry experience. And that provided me with more opportunities to continue to teach and to study. And others continued to affirm those interests and those gifts. But again, you go off to seminary and you wonder, like, okay, so I like this kind of stuff, but can I really hack it? Can I really do well? And went off to seminary and did well and had professors affirm, again, those gifts and those interests. And then the Lord opened a door for me to study at Wheaton with Doug Moo, a New Testament scholar there, who I very much admired and appreciated. And highly competitive program to get in the first place. And so the fact that I was able to get in seemed to be confirmation that the Lord was leading in that direction. But then again, you finish your PhD program, and it's not like there was a robust, booming job market at the time. And so when the Lord opened an opportunity for me to interview here at Grace, I, continued forward, and just the Lord continued to open these doors at the right moments for me to get me here to Grace. And then once that happened and the interview process continued and they offered me a position here at Grace in 2006, and I've been here ever since. And it seems like the Lord has been in this the whole way, and he continues to provide opportunities for me to teach here, to mentor seminary students, future pastors and missionaries, and as well as has given me opportunities to write and have a perhaps a little bit broader ministry outside of students here at Grace as well.
Well, it kind of doesn't surprise me, Matt, because when I think back to those days, do you remember this, Matt? I remember that, we'd have our Thursday weekly meeting, but then at some point, I can't remember if it was that night or Sunday night or something, we did this thing called Delta Cardia. Do you remember Delta Cardia? It was.
I do.
I don't know if it was a one-off or what it was, but it was this idea of going deeper into the scriptures and getting a little more theological, and in perfectly, normal 90s Christian fashion, we took some Greek words and we smashed them together. And
absolutely.
But I have this memory, and maybe my memory's off a little bit, but I think we were going through Romans, and I remember teaching on Romans 3, and I can't remember if you had Romans 2 or Romans 4, but I remember afterwards thinking, wow, those were two totally different talks. But I remember the Delta Cardia, and I remember, Matt is an incredible teacher, and it's just been fun to watch your path along the way. And then, as I mentioned, we connected at Trinity as well. I think back of our Trinity days here a little bit, and I think about all those professors that I had and what an impact they had on my life. And so now that's what you're doing for students. Matt, I'm kind of curious, what are some of the courses that you teach at Grace? And I don't know if you can say you have a favorite, but maybe what are some of the ones you really enjoy teaching?
So I teach the entire Greek sequence, so 4 classes. 2 are beginning Greek, and then 2 exegesis classes. And in addition to those, I teach an undergraduate course at Grace on New Testament Bible exposition. So it's an English-based class. And I've been going through Philippians for the past, probably 7 or 8 years now in that class, based on the English Bible and working with undergrad students. That's a lot of fun. But the other class that I haven't mentioned yet, which is my favorite, is my New Testament theology course, where basically I end up doing biblical theology. And we talk about a lot of things like how do the New Testament authors use the Old Testament? And then we trace a lot of themes that run from Genesis to Revelation, and I show how they begin in the Old Testament and then develop into the New Testament and Christ as the fulfillment of those. And it's a great opportunity for me to get to teach in some areas where I'm also doing some writing oftentimes. And so that's really my favorite. I do also teach, I mentioned Greek exegesis 2, and I get to go through Galatians, which I have a commentary out on that. And so fun for me to get to go verse by verse with students through Galatians and help them to see how careful study of the Greek text points them to deeper understanding of the text and positions them well to be able to teach it and apply it in their ministries as well. So those are the favorites that I have, and I'm grateful that I'm able to teach in areas where I'm also interested in writing. That enables me to take the things that I'm learning in my own private study and immediately take them in the classroom, and vice versa, in terms of getting questions in the classroom that spur me on to think more and show up in my writing as a way of benefiting myself from being in the classroom and learning from my students, or being pushed to think more deeply about specific things.
Well, you mentioned taking students through the book of Philippians, and that's one of my favorite New Testament books to go through. And in fact, there's two resources that I tend to go to when I'm studying Philippians. One is my marked up copy of D.A. Carson's Basics for Believers. I think it's in a new cover, maybe a new title or something like that, but mine has been read and reread and highlighted and underlined. But Matt, your commentary on Philippians is right there next to it. It's just a fantastic one. It's very accessible, and it works. I've used it devotionally to just work through the text. So it is fun every once in a while just to see, as I look through some of the book catalogs from the big publishers, to see your name pop up and go, okay, there's another one. I better put that on my wish list, or wait until I get to the Gospel Coalition conference and see if I can get it on a discount at least. So
yeah.
Well, when you're not writing books, Matt, and you're not writing or teaching seminary courses, you're also these days co-hosting with your colleague John Sloat this wildly popular Various and Sundry podcast. I love the subtitle, at least. It's a conversation between friends about theology, ministry, Bible, culture, and sports. It is indeed Various and Sundry. Our church, we're just getting this podcast thing off the ground. This is going to be episode 15. And when I looked on Spotify, it looks like you guys are over 250 episodes. Is that right?
Yeah. So the day we're recording this, episode 256 released. Okay. So we have done one episode a week, every week, haven't missed one yet. Since the first week of January 2020.
Wow.
So 256 consecutive weeks of episodes. Now, sometimes because of our travel schedules, we'll have to record an episode in advance because we're not in town together.
Right.
But yeah, we've hit so far 256 consecutive weeks of episodes.
Well, it'd be interesting. I'd have to go back. I joined you. I can't remember at what point, but early on. I bet it's a bit of a time capsule if you go back to maybe episode 25-ish or something like that. It would have been right in the beginning of the pandemic, and I'm sure there's a lot of podcasts like that of just where we all were when that went down. Yeah.
Well, and what's funny to me is we were early in on the COVID stuff because John was going to lead a student trip to I want to say Hong Kong, and so he was monitoring sort of the developments on this COVID thing as we were kind of tracking it when it was just starting to burst onto the scene in terms of like news reports, like late January, early February of, there's this virus that's spreading in Asia, and it looks like it might be a big deal kind of thing. So we were pretty early in on it. And actually, I think that one of the reasons we ended up doing a weekly podcast was that when the pandemic hit, it was like, well, we really have some time on our hands, so we might as well keep this going.
Yeah.
We had initially planned on, maybe the first 7 or 8 weeks doing one episode a week to kind of get things launched, and then maybe settle into an every other week thing. And it just kind of gained this momentum that we've kept up with for now. Almost, this will be the end of 5 years at the end of this particular calendar year.
Well, if imitation is indeed the sincerest form of flattery, then prepare to be flattered, because I've just enjoyed listening to you guys, and it's fun to just kind of say, oh, that's a great idea. I might borrow that. I might steal that and think about that. But just over the course of those 250 episodes, what have you learned about maybe the medium of podcasting? It does seem to be podcasts are everywhere.
They are. And I think for us, it grew out of our friendship. The tagline that you mentioned is not just sort of a kind of PR thing. It's the podcast has its origins in John and I being friends for many years now. And these were the kind of conversations we were having in our basement on Sunday afternoons as we would, after church, he'd come over for lunch. we'd have conversations about books, theology, culture, ministry, sports. And there was a day when one of my sons said, "You guys should do a podcast." And we're like, "A podcast about what?" And he's like, "This is
Yeah.
the podcast. This is, you guys talking about these things." And we kind of laughed, and then some things fell into place when it came to equipment and timing and those sorts of things. But I think for us, some of the big things that are takeaways have been the hopefully, I think it comes through the nature of our friendship, just the reality
Yes.
of we really enjoy each other.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this is not a show in the classic sense of that. It's really two friends talking, and just consistency. I just think us getting off to that start and being consistent, and now it's become a great excuse for us to hang out every week because we're both really busy now, and his role has changed at the institution, and he's even busier than he used to be. And this is a great excuse for us to build into our schedule every week, typically Monday afternoons, for us to catch up and record episodes, but also have some off the pod conversations
Yes.
that don't make it on the air, and just for us to maintain our friendship. So it's been great.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's one of the things I really appreciate about it, and other ones like that, of just that real conversational style. I mean, you guys can be talking about things that are really maybe only more relevant to you two or life at Grace. And even though I'm distant from that, it feels very inviting. It feels very conversational. It doesn't feel like I'm out of the picture there. And so I do want to thank you and John, just for your ministry through that. And it's just a lot of fun, and it makes for some good drive time listening as well. So yeah.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you listening, and it's still a lot of fun for us to do. And I think as long as it remains fun, I can see us continuing to do it, even though it's getting more challenging just with our busy schedules to fit that in. But we really enjoy it, and we like to basically say, well, it's an excuse for us to hang out, and if people end up listening in addition to that, that's great. We have no illusions of becoming this top 25 podcast or anything like that. We talk about things that interest us, and if people want to listen, that's great. Otherwise, it's just, well, it's the two of us hanging out. So,
well, I think in baseball, it used to be at least that if you were a 300 game winner, that you were Hall of Fame worthy. So you're almost to 300, and maybe that'll put you there in sort of the podcast Hall of Fame here.
There you go.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Advent. We're going to post this episode kind of in the middle of the Advent season. And I don't know about you, Matt, but I grew up in a more liturgical tradition when I was a kid, the church that I grew up in. And so Advent was a big deal. And it always felt like Advent was a big deal in more liturgical churches. But it really seems to me that Advent, not just Christmas, but Advent, has received greater and greater attention even in non-liturgical churches in recent years. I'm curious why you think, or if you think, why is that?
Yeah, I do think you're right. I think more churches, even those from non-liturgical traditions, are paying attention to Advent, and I think part of it is seeing strategic opportunities to tap into the cultural mood. As our culture continues to move further and further away from broadly Judeo-Christian frameworks and values, I think that the Christmas season actually does provide us with a built-in opportunity to talk about things that otherwise might be more challenging to talk about. And I think that is being reflected not just in churches doing Advent series or those kinds of things, but even in the growth of Advent devotionals, of books and other resources that are coming out that provide an opportunity to explain the story of Jesus and why it's significant that he was born. And so I think that that is one of the reasons why more and more churches are taking advantage of and being intentional about talking about Advent and building up in the weeks to come before Christmas an anticipation that leads to an even more sort of passionate and excited celebration of the birth of Jesus.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Advent devotionals, and that's exactly right. Just even at our church the last few years, that's what we've done is we've tried to make available these Advent devotionals. And I don't remember that even 10 or 15 years ago in ministry of them being as widely available as they are today. We just picked one up from the Gospel Coalition. It's called Unto Us, 25 Advent Devotions about the Messiah. And I look forward to reading it and going through that. But I'm sure that when I get done with it, it's going to go on the shelf with my other Advent devotionals, and it's probably going to land in my Christology section of my bookshelf. And that's a word, it's not a real complicated word, but Matt, this word Christology, can you help us just understand what theologians mean by Christology, and even why might Christology be something for folks to consider during this Advent season?
Yeah, so Christology is simply the formal title that theologians use for the study of who Christ is. And that formal title can help or hurt depending on what kind of context you're in. But basically, understood broadly, Christology is dealing with any issue related to who is Christ, who is Jesus. And, when you start to unpack that, when you start to dig into the reality of who Jesus is, there are a lot of pieces that go into that. And good, robust Christology deals with not just sort of specific, well, he's fully God and fully man. That's a good starting point. But even understanding what that means has to be rooted in the biblical witness. And this is where I think both systematic theology, which is traditionally understood as sort of asking the question of what does the Bible say about, and then filling in a subject. So what does the Bible say about Christ? And then trying to bring together all of the texts that talk about Christ, where that systematic theology and biblical theology, which is more an attempt to trace out themes and understand using the Bible's own categories, who Jesus is. And to do that well, you have to understand the Old Testament and the promises made about Christ and who he would be and what he would do. And so that's where you're really looking at things like, what does it mean that Jesus is the promised son of David? Well, you have to go back and look in the Old Testament and the promises that God made to David and how those relate to the promises God made to Israel and to Abraham. And ultimately, going back to the garden, where God promised this descendant of Adam and Eve who would crush the serpent. So that's more of a biblical theological approach. And both are valuable and important when we think about trying to understand who Jesus is.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we hear a word like Christology and we think, oh, that's what the theologians do. Let's leave it to the academics. But I think we do a lot more Christology on a Sunday morning or just in our personal times in the Word. And, you're talking about biblical theology, kind of that big picture, that overarching, not only does what do the New Testament passages say, but what does the Old Testament passages say? I've even seen kind of a rise in works on that theme for all kinds, again, not just the academic world, but for believers wherever they are in their faith. One I think of in particular is the children's Bible story book that Kevin DeYoung and others were involved with. This Biggest Story, which that's exactly what that is. It's fulfilling, or it's filling out a biblical theology. And so even a book like that's accessible to families and children is talking about Christology.
Yeah, absolutely. And in one sense, you it's not overly simplistic to say that Christology really is just the answer to the question, who is Jesus?
Hmm.
And that's a question that everybody needs to answer, because how we answer that question, it's not overstated to say that our answer to that question ultimately determines our eternal destiny.
Yes.
That if we get that question wrong, or if we answer the question, but then in one sense correctly at an intellectual level, but don't respond appropriately at the sort of heart and will level of committing our lives to Jesus, then that makes all the difference. And so, we can throw the term Christology around and it can sound like this big, important theology term. And yet, at the end of the day, everyone needs to have a Christology if you understand it as answering the question, who is Jesus? And in one sense, why does it matter who he is?
Yeah. And so to me, just this Advent season, you're right, Matt, that's a question we all should be asking. Not just, hey, let's commemorate Jesus's birth one more time, but let's all reflect on this question of who is Jesus. And let's go back to not just the familiar New Testament text, but what does the Bible say as a whole about who is Jesus? Now, another term that gets thrown around, I think it's even in some of our Christmas hymns, Hail the Incarnate Deity, is this word incarnation. And it's not a word that shows up in the text of Scripture, but it's a concept that I think is there. Matt, can you help us understand what do we mean by incarnation? And even though we don't find the word, where do we find that in Scripture?
Yeah, it's really it's one of these theological terms that tries to, in a shorthand way, capture a very important biblical reality. So, incarnation really, it comes from Latin roots that talk about in flesh, is the idea of that Jesus came in the flesh, that God took on flesh and dwelled among us. That's basically taken right from John 1:14, the idea of the Word became flesh and dwelled among us. And then you see it in Philippians 2, where you have it talking about Christ being in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, made himself nothing, that kind of idea. And he took on the form of a servant. That's his incarnation. He was born in the likeness of men. And so that kind of language is trying to capture this idea that that Christ, as the second person of the Trinity, took on flesh at a specific point in human history without in any way compromising his deity. He became fully man as well.
Yeah, we in our church, we're going through a Sunday school class right now that's taking us through early church history. It's kind of the years 100 through 600. And just this past Sunday and this coming Sunday, we're looking at some of those questions of how the early church really thought through to what degree is Jesus fully God and fully man, and how do these things go together? And certainly this was some of the rise of some of the more heretical teachings, and then kind of steering it back onto the path of it's here's really what Scripture is teaching. It's the birth of some of the creeds and things like that. But let's go even just a little bit deeper. Here's a term that maybe a number of people haven't heard, but I think is right in here. It's this idea of the hypostatic union. Maybe only theologians throw around that term. But again, I think the concept might be worth us thinking through. What does hypostatic union have to do with Christmas?
Yeah, so it's in short, it's the idea that Jesus Christ was 100% God and 100% man, fully God, fully human. Now I know that our math majors, our math people in the audience might bristle at that, because that sounds like 100% plus 100% equals 200%. But in this particular scenario, it's important to affirm that Jesus Christ was fully God, that it's not like he gave up any attributes of God to become human. He was fully God in the flesh, and he was fully human. That he was not sort of this weird mixture of like 50-50, of 50% God and 50% human, but he was fully God and fully human. And one of the reasons that the early church wrestled with this is because it stretches our intellectual capacities to really understand how that works. Yeah. And yet, the biblical testimony is very clear that he was both fully God and fully human, and that both elements of that are essential for our redemption. That he needed to be fully human in order to obey on our behalf and to be our substitute, to take upon himself the punishment that we deserved. And yet he also needed to be fully God in order to accomplish that redemption on our behalf. And so holding both of those together is so vital that the early church, when there were sort of, ended up being heretical teachings that would compromise on one of those. They'd compromise on, well, he only seemed to be human. He looked human, but he wasn't really fully human. Or, well, he was sort of an exalted human, but not really fully God, or he was adopted, into as God's son. No. He has always been the Son of God from all of eternity. And holding those two things together is so vital that the early church had to really hash it out and affirm and reaffirm both of those realities, because the very nature of our salvation hinges upon him being fully God and fully man.
Yeah, we talked about in our Sunday school class on this that, some of these early teachers that kind of went down the wrong path, they weren't necessarily trying to do so maliciously. They just overemphasized one aspect over the other. And we do hold those two concepts in tension. And it is admittedly difficult. The church has been thinking these things through for over 2,000 years. And we're just, we go back to, well, what is the consistent, clear understanding of what the scriptures teach? And, there's a number of passages we can go to. You mentioned the Philippians 2 passage. And I think it's important, in December, especially in our Sunday morning ministries, when we're choosing our preaching texts, this time of year, we often go to Matthew chapter 1 and chapter 2 and Luke chapter 1 and chapter 2. In fact, even at our church, we're just starting a sermon series through the Gospel of Luke, and we've lined it up so that December we're going to be in chapter 2 and then on to chapter 3 the next month. But I always, especially when I was preaching regularly, always tried to also bring in some other texts to show that these doctrines don't just show up in the early chapters of the Gospels. And yes, we can go back to even Isaiah chapter 9 and other places, many places in Isaiah for that matter, all over the Scriptures. But Matt, one of my absolute favorites is found in Galatians chapter 4, Galatians 4 through 7. You mentioned that you've written a commentary on Galatians. You take students through Galatians. So I'd love for you to help us just kind of quickly think through a little bit of this as a Christmas text. Let me read it. It's Galatians 4 through 7 says, "But when the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. Because you are his sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but God's child. And since you are his child, God has made you also an heir. Now, again, Matt, you've written a New Testament commentary on Galatians, and so you've obviously spent some time in that text. If you were asked to preach at your church in December, would you consider a passage like this? And if so, how do you think you'd approach it in the Advent Christmas context?
Yeah, I absolutely think that this would make a great Christmas text. I think that it's certainly the case that pastors who have had an extended sort of ministry in one location often feel like, okay, I've done the Luke 2, I've done the Matthew 1, now what?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that you can't come back to these texts again and again, but I do think Galatians 4 is a potentially utilized text when it comes to an Advent season. And I think that even looking at this passage, you have a lot that you can unpack. Even that initial line there, when the set time had fully come. Well, that speaks to God's sovereignty over human history and the fact that he had been preparing all along for the arrival of Christ through his promises made in the Old Testament. And I think that, even there, a potential connection point is we live at a time and a culture where it seems like things are often out of control. Mm-hmm. And we're sort of hyped up on this 24-hour news cycle of the latest crisis, or social media trying to stir us up into this kind of frenzy of the world's just falling apart and chaotic, and it just seems like everything is breaking apart. And to be able to say, God has a plan, and he is sovereignly in control, and he sent Christ at just the right moment into human history to accomplish and deal with our greatest need. And even just the fact that you have that language of God sent his Son, that speaks to the fact that the Son existed before he was born. It goes on to talk about being born under the law, which speaks to Jesus' Jewish heritage, his being in the line ultimately of Abraham and David, as Matthew's gospel begins. But then also when it talks about being born of a woman, that speaks to his broader humanity, that Jesus was sent for both Jew and Gentile, that this promise that God had made all the way back in Genesis 3 about sending a serpent crusher, someone who would obey where Adam and Eve had failed, and then defeat the serpent who had defeated them, and to be that key person to make all things right. We long for justice in this world. All of us can think of situations, whether it's personal or even cultural or historical or those sorts of things, where we say, that's not right, that there's injustice. And to think that part of what Christmas helps us realize is that God has taken action to set all things right. And it's going to be through his Son, Jesus. And that essential to that is recognizing that we have fallen short and we need to be rescued from the consequences of our own sin and our own rebellion against God. And that the beauty of the gospel is that Jesus satisfies God's justice on our behalf. He obeys in our place. He dies in our place. And all of that is embedded in a text like this, that you notice it goes on to talk about adopting us into his family and giving us his Spirit. So all of those realities are embedded here. And I think that, when it comes to a Christmas text, this would make an excellent choice to be able to highlight that the significance of Christmas is not just this cute little story of a baby born in a manger, but it's ultimately God's plan to set all things right and to offer us hope in the midst of the darkness of this world. And I think that's a message that each one of us needs, and our culture needs to hear over and over again.
Well, and that's why, back to our conversation about these Advent devotionals, the better ones really do bring us to not just the gospel texts, but texts like these, and help us to just think through these things. That yes, this message that we're bringing out in the Advent season, it's all over the Scriptures, and really it all comes together. And well, thank you, Matt. It makes me your Galatians commentary is one that I've not picked up yet. So maybe I need to put that on my Christmas list this year and make sure I get that one. But one I always kind of joke a little bit though too that one of these days, if anybody ever lets me do it, the Christmas, the out of the ordinary Christmas text I want to preach is from Revelation 12, the woman and the red dragon. And it might be a little stretch that it's a Christmas text. Maybe someday when our lead pastor is on sabbatical in December, I might just go ahead and do it. But no, but it just kind of goes to show they're all over the place in terms of these things that fit with this Advent theme.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That Revelation 12 text might take a little bit more work.
It probably, a little more non-traditional. And I've always thought, that would be the Sunday that some guest would be there, and maybe not the best choice for those that are maybe just kind of coming out and seeking a little bit more in December. So maybe we'll hold that off for another time. But well, Matt, it's been fun to kind of think through some of these theological ideas and talk about some of these texts. But one of the things we do in this podcast is at the end of every episode, whoever I have on as my guest, I ask them one more question. And it doesn't have as much to do with the topic we've been talking about, but I think it's an important one to probe and just to can hear from folks here at our church at Ifree Bemidji. We frequently talk about becoming deeply devoted followers of Jesus together. That's sort of our mission statement, and we want to just reiterate that's what it means to live out this life of discipleship, becoming deeply devoted followers of Jesus together. Matt, I want to ask you just briefly, what's one thing that you have been blessed by lately that is deepening your devotion to Jesus?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as I reflect on that, I have been reading through the book of Ezekiel lately. And that's, one of those Old Testament books that can be a little hard to really connect with sometimes because the imagery is so foreign to us, and yet what I've been struck with is again just the sweetness of God's promises in passages like Ezekiel 11 and Ezekiel 36 about the promise of God transforming his people, of taking out the heart of stone and replacing it with the heart of flesh, of putting his spirit inside of us. And then what just blows me away every time I reflect on this and read through this is the fact that he promises to not only put his spirit inside of us, but to cause us to walk in his statutes, to give us the power to obey. And I think that is something that we as Christians often downplay sometimes, that we fall into this mindset of, well, I've always just been this way, and I'm just going to be this way until Christ returns or until I die. And I've just been reminded afresh that the power of the gospel is able to transform us, and not just forgive us of our sins, which is foundational and central and crucial, but that lasting change can happen in our lives by the power of God's Spirit. And I don't ever want to underestimate that. You know, all of us have battles against sin in our lives that we have to fight continually. And it's easy to just become discouraged and buy into the lie of the enemy that says you'll never change. You'll always be like this. And a passage like Ezekiel reminds us that God intends to transform us. And the New Testament comes along, and I think of a passage like Philippians 2, verse 13, where it talks about after commanding us to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling, Paul writes, "For God is the one at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure." And that passage, I think, is drawing on ideas from Ezekiel 36 that God puts his spirit inside of us to give us the desire and the power to obey. And even in the strongest challenges we face in our Christian life, we can always ask God to give us the power and the desire to obey. And it's something that he has promised to do. And I think that that's not just an individual thing. That's a community thing. It's a corporate thing of being able to encourage one another with God has given us his spirit, and he gives us the desire and the power to obey. And he often will do that through the encouragement and prayers of other people, not just our own individual walk with the Lord. And so I've just been reminded afresh of that as I've been working my way through Ezekiel.
It's funny that you mention the book of Ezekiel. Just this morning, I was listening to a podcast from the Carson Center, and they're just starting to get into lectures from D.A. Carson on the book of Ezekiel. And what a rich book. But yes, much like the book of Revelation, that apocalyptic literature, it kind of scares us a little bit. We think, oh boy, I don't know what to do with this, and all the more reason to just find some good resources to help us think through that. Because when you get to the heart of the message there, again, such key themes, key ideas that find their way into the New Testament as well. And really can be an encouragement and a blessing to us. So thank you, Matt. That's an encouragement to not neglect books of the Bible like the book of Ezekiel. So, well, Matt, this has been fun. It's been good to kind of catch up. I don't know if you're planning to go to TGC 25 this spring in Indianapolis, go to the Gospel Coalition Conference again.
I will be there.
Okay.
And actually, I'll be doing one of the breakout kind of events for Zondervan. We're doing an event on a recent book that came out that I co-authored on how to study the Bible's use of the Bible. And so that'll be one of these kind of ancillary events connected with TGC, and I'll be there. I intend to be there for the entire conference. So it would definitely be good to catch up and see in person.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's. Usually we bump into each other in the book hall there, and it's almost overwhelming, the exhibitors and the books there. But always a fun one for me to go to. I try not to miss that conference. But Matt, thank you so much for giving us your time today, sharing just a little bit about how God shaped your life, and just even blessing us with these things as we get ready for the Advent season. So, Matt, so good to talk to you and to catch up, and really appreciate your ministry.
Thanks, Eric. Grateful for your ministry in the local church and the ways that you have the opportunity to take the materials that people like me and others produce and help people grow in their love for Christ and in their devotion to Him.
Well, Matt, happy Thanksgiving to you and to your family. Say hello to Kate and your family. And we'll catch up this spring at the Gospel Coalition.
Sounds good. Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it.
Well, that'll do it for another episode of the Deeply Devoted podcast. Once again, we'd love to hear a little bit from you, just any feedback about how things are going on this podcast, maybe some questions you have, comments, ideas for the podcast. You can always email those to me at podcast@efcbemidji.org. And I'm excited about what's coming up in the coming weeks. Here's some fun ideas as we get closer and closer to the end of 2024, and then looking ahead to 2025 and future episodes there. So once again, folks, thanks for listening.